course, concludes the joint press statements by the Russian President Putin and Prime Minister Modi. And the key highlights of that, of course, was that Prime Minister Modi, right at the beginning of his press statement, said that this was a privileged partnership between Russia and India, that they had wide-ranging discussions on key bilateral issues and regional issues, including Afghanistan, the Indo-Pacific, the G20, our energy needs. President Putin also spoke at length about how both countries believed in multilateralism, and that was the core of the global system, a possible hint to the United States. And President Putin also, of course, said that there was coherence in key international issues, and that there was going to be heightened cooperation between India and Russia at the SCO, the BRICS summit, and at G20 as well, and that they had also discussed the Iran nuclear deal. Remember, that remains a bone of contention with the United States as well. And before we wrap up this show, let me just go back to our guests. We have two guests, of course, from Russia today, and Ambassador Singh continues to be with us, and joining us now is Petro Topchikonov, a Russian analyst as well as a researcher. And I hope, Peter, I've got your name right. If not, please do correct me. What did you make of the press statements there? You know, the obvious issues were, of course, of the bilateral cooperation, the two sides, but they did touch upon some very, very critical issues like the Iran deal, the Indo-Pacific, and also that both sides believed in a multilateral world order.
I believe that one of the most important things about this summit between leaders of India and Russia is that both nations are able to defend their relations from external effects. Because as it was well known before the summit, that India was under heavy pressure from the United States about the possible deal on S-400 air defense system. And Russia and India defended their right to have their relations independent from external influence, and also they demonstrated their ability to continue the track that was already marked in previous summits and documents between Russia and India. The track for enlarging strategic partnership.
Right. And Ambassador Singh, before the press statements began, we were talking about how Afghanistan would, of course, feature in this discussion, as would Iran and other issues. And of course, trade remains one of the areas where we haven't seen an expansion as we would expect between India and Russia. And President Putin did touch upon that, saying that we hope that mutual trade would actually grow and grow to 21% in the next decade or so. So those are areas of concern that both leaders are certainly aware of.
Absolutely, and several things struck me as I watched the press conference. First, you can see the warmth of the relationship between the two leaders. Second, you notice that they've spent a fair amount of time with each other since yesterday. There was a private discussion, there was a dinner, closed dinner between the two of them, and more than 3 hours of discussions today. So that again helps to contribute to strengthen understanding. Both emphasized, and I think that's important, the Prime Minister in his own comment about the relevance of the relationship in the changing world. And if you see the title of the joint statement, as was indicated, was Enduring Partnership in a Changing World. So I think that's the message. That is a long-standing partnership, and it remains relevant with all the changes taking place. Again, in the various agreements and comments, there's a lot of emphasis on economic cooperation. For example, in the agreements that were exchanged, there's cooperation on fertilizers, small industry, railways, of course, nuclear, then participation of Russia and support to India's effort on the human space flight. And that is very important because that's an area where Russia has a lot of experience. And they also emphasize the importance of multipolarity and multilateralism in international relations. So I would say that the comments that were made and the results of the discussions were broadly along expected lines, which we had discussed earlier. And what the meeting has done has been to bring back the focus to widen areas of cooperation, especially on the economic side. And as you saw, the Indian Prime Minister mentioned that we want to extend our cooperation from the Arctic to the Far East, from the ocean to space, just indicating that our aim is to broad base it further and widen the dimensions of cooperation.
Yes, absolutely. I'll just go across to my colleague Siddhant, who also joins us. He was tracking all the developments through the day yesterday and today. And Siddhant, key highlights, of course, were the 8 agreements, as Ambassador Singh was pointing out, going way beyond, of course, defense ties and collaboration as well. So expand to us the highlights of this press statement from both sides.
Well, one of the key highlights was, of course, the deals the pacts which was signed. 8 pacts have been signed. One, of course, on space, specifically on India's Gaganyaan, sending Indian to the space with, of course, Russian help. But other than that, the focus was also on trade. Both the leaders mentioned about how to cooperate, about issues of mutual concerns and, of course, issues of mutual interest. But something that stood out was that there was no mention of the S-400 deal by either the President of Russia or either Prime Minister Narendra Modi, though it has been confirmed by Kremlin that the deal has happened, it has been signed. But of course, the media is still guessing here that whether the deal officially has been signed or not, because there was no official word, still no official word. We are now waiting for the joint statement by Russia and India, in which there could be the mention of the deal. But other than that, the focus largely remains on trade, on how there has been a long-standing, time-tested relationship between Moscow and New Delhi.
Yeah, Siddhant, very important you brought that up, that the media has been left guessing there on the S-400 missile deal, because, you know, top sources, of course, from the Russian side have also been indicating that that deal has been signed, but there's no, sort of sense of that at the press statement. Let me take that to Fred Weir, Ambassador Singh, and also Peter, who joins us from Moscow. And Fred, if I can come to you, why do you think that there was no mention of the S-400? This was, of course, the most anticipated here in India. This was the big headline, but both the leaders seem to have missed it at the press statement, although we hope that in the joint, in the press conference, but we hope it comes up in the press statement nonetheless.
You know, I've covered several of these summits, and I've noticed that there is quite a difference between the priorities of journalists and the priorities of politicians. I think the S-400 deal is a done thing, but it is usual to separate the defense sector from the more general issues, and there was a very broad statement of cooperation across many fields, which is quite usual. There were many good points made. It was overwhelmingly positive, as everyone is saying, and that was also to be expected. But as for things like the defense deals, and I think it's not just the S-400, I think India wants to lease another Akula-class submarine from Russia. That would be a very big deal. There are several things there. We'll hear about them, but they usually come in a different package. So not to worry about that. I think the thing that is unspoken and that you have to look in those statements about both sides reaffirming the commitment to multilateralism is what happens if the United States does sanction India, whether over the S-400 thing or over its continued purchases of oil from Iran. What if that becomes an issue? There is no talk about this, but they must have discussed it privately, and there must be like working committees on how to circumvent American sanctions, how to create special payment vehicles, right, so that they can continue doing this business. That would be the thing that's completely unspoken at this point.
Right, Fred. That's in fact completely right, that it was completely unspoken what would happen in the event of the CAATSA sanctions actually playing out. Ambassador Singh, would you agree with Fred Weir there that it was the unspoken that really stood out in this, and it's not what the media headlines would be, but the fact that there is a major concern both in Russia and India that what happens if the US actually imposes the sanctions as it has when it comes to the Chinese?
The statements that were made by the Indian Prime Minister and President Putin focused on the broad overall dimensions of the relationship. And again, it has been normal practice for India in meetings of this at this level not to refer to specific deals, especially specific defense deals, because that is done at another level, not in a meeting with the Prime Minister and the head of state or government of another country. So that's not where it is brought up. So it would not be surprising at all that there is no specific reference to the S-400 coming out of this meeting, whether or not an agreement has been signed. So we have to just wait and see about the manner in which the formal announcement is made about the S-400, about which there have been, as you've said, indications that it is already done. So we have to see how the formal announcement is done, but one would not expect it to come out specifically from this meeting. That's not how it is handled.
Okay.
And so that's fine. And then, of course, in terms of how to deal with the US sanctions, as I mentioned, on Iran and the oil purchases, that's something that India had handled between 2012 and 2015. And I'm sure India will find a way to deal with that challenge.
Okay.
And also on Russia, my own assessment is that US will find a way not to sanction India. And if they were to do it, one can only say US would be shooting itself in the foot on the S-400 rather than really creating a challenge for India.
Right. Okay, let me just go across back to my colleague Siddhant. And Siddhant, we have already discussed that the S-400 didn't come up in the press statements, but we can obviously expect it in the joint declaration later, as is the case, as Ambassador Singh is also pointing out, when the Rafale deal was also mentioned very fleetingly when the French President Macron was here. So the expectation is still ripe that it will come up in the joint statement in detail. Siddhant.
Well, of course, we all are waiting for the joint statement, but that, of course, will come once the President and Prime Minister Narendra Modi had spoken at the business event, which will take place shortly at another venue here in New Delhi. So after that, we do expect the joint statement to be released. That is the statement in which we do expect the mention of S-400. But there has been this hush-hush affair about this deal, and of course, no mention by the leaders here had put some kind of speculation, at least by the journalists. And as one of our panelists mentioned, that the priorities are different for journalists and politicians sometimes, but right now priority for the journalists remain the big deal, S-400 deal, because that gives an edge to India's security and defense architecture. But that said, other than that, the focus, of course, was the camaraderie between both the leaders, the body language, and of course how the relationship has panned out. The Indian Prime Minister started his statement by referring the President of Russia, Mr. Putin, as a friend. He also mentioned about the Sochi informal summit and talked about how India and Russia want to have a multilateral world, how multilateralism is here to stay. That was the focus. And Iran was also mentioned. The Russian President also mentioned Syria, saying that he briefed the Indian counterpart on the Syrian issue. That is something that has been a cause of concern, at least for Russia and, of course, Middle East. That's the major concern. Of course, India is physically and geographically is away, so that doesn't bother us. But of course, any development in any part of the world concerns India too. So other than that, the focus was on trade. The Russian president mentioned that how trade needs to be increased by the year 2025. Remember, the bilateral trade between Russia and India are still not at an optimal level, and through the north-south transport corridor, both the countries are trying to increase that.
Yeah. All right, let me take that to Peter, who's still with us from Moscow as well. And Peter, there's a variance in what the Indians want and what the Russians may want. Now, the Indians, of course, the defense deals and the partnership is very important, as is energy. But for the Russians, who are, of course, seeing the economy not doing so well, it could go well beyond that. And that is why we saw President Putin highlight the trade issues a lot more. Would you concur?
I believe that, unfortunately, trade and economic relations, this is the weakest part of the partnership of Russia and India. If to carve out nuclear peaceful cooperation and arms trade and joint development of nuclear weapons, and joint development of military equipment and weapons, so Russia and India have a very limited progress in other areas. For years, we were trying to overcome the threshold of $10 billion trade turnout between Russia and India, and we weren't very successful in this area.
Right.
So that is during this press conference, both leaders highlighted exactly what they want from the bilateral relations: to have progress in trade and economic relations, to have better numbers in this part of the relation between Russia and India.
Okay.
So I didn't mention a lot about arms trade because, as for now, everything is fine. So there is no crisis. But there is a crisis in trade and economic relations. We need better efforts and better results here.
Okay. Fred, I just want to go back to a statement that you made before the press conference where you said that Afghanistan will be a key point where we need more discussion when it comes to India and Russia, because the Americans are going to leave, and that's going to leave a vacuum, and it's for the Indians and the Russians then to decide what to do with Afghanistan. Do you think that enough time was spent at this press conference, to talk about Afghanistan? We got a hint of what the two sides may say, may of course emphasize in the joint statement later, but there was a fleeting reference to Afghanistan as well.
Well, I don't know, and I do know that there are differences of opinion between India and Russia over this, how to deal with the Taliban and so on. But I don't, and it's not just a Russia-India bilateral problem, of course.
Yes.
I think where this will work itself out is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which everybody in the region is now a member of. And that is the organization which has a security dimension to it, and where the future of Afghanistan is almost certainly going to have to be projects. I think this is a key issue coming up in the years to come. What to do about Afghanistan, how to squire it through whatever the transitional period is after the Americans have gone. This is a key issue for everybody in that region. It's India and Russia, but also China, Iran, and the countries of Central Asia, the former Soviet countries. And so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is the place to look for those developments to happen.
Okay. And Ambassador Singh, would you agree that, of course, Afghanistan's not just a bilateral issue, obviously, but there are other key players in the region, who will also, of course, have a say when it comes to Afghanistan. And as we keep talking about, conversions between this relationship between India and Russia, there are also points of divergence, and also when it comes to our allies. Before I let you expand on that, we're also picking up, of course, from some wire services that final touches may still be being put to the S-400 deal. Ambassador Singh, how do you take this?
On Afghanistan, is that what you want me to comment on?
Yes, first that.
Yeah, so on Afghanistan, India and Russia, for example, had worked very closely together before 9/11, at the time when the Taliban were controlling 90% of Afghanistan and only 10% of the territory was with the Northern Alliance. And at that time, there had been close cooperation. Over the past some years, there has been some divergence of approach because India has done a lot in Afghanistan, provided a lot of economic assistance. And today, according to most polls that are done, India is seen as the most popular country in Afghanistan. But we have been able to do that within the broad security framework provided by the United States. And Russia, of course, because of its own difficulties with the United States, has been reaching out to the Taliban, according to reports. And Iran has also been trying to challenge the US presence in Afghanistan. So in the new situation where the assessment is that in the US, the political will to sustain the effort in Afghanistan is rapidly evaporating. And therefore, how will the US deal with Afghanistan in the years to come has become a question mark. But the fear in the US would be that if they pull out too rapidly, then there could be a terrorist attack in the United States emanating from Afghanistan, and that would be a big political challenge for the US decision makers, for the US president. So they are trying to find a way to promote some reconciliation in Afghanistan, involve the Taliban in talks with themselves, in talks with the Afghan government to see if somehow the situation can be stabilized, which would give them a way to pull out. But should the US, for some reason, decide to pull out without putting in place any kind of enduring structure, there will be impact on India. There will be impact on Russia. Of course, Pakistan, neighbors Afghanistan, Iran, China, the Central Asian countries. And I think one of the points that Fred made is interesting, that if US and Europe were to pull out of Afghanistan because they are not physically neighboring Afghanistan, although they fear the challenge of terrorism based in Afghanistan or the Pak region, getting out of them, then the countries directly in the neighborhood would be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries. And therefore, in that format, how is the issue discussed could become important. But there the challenge is that Pakistan has been unwilling to discuss seriously issues related to Afghanistan in any forum where India is present. So that remains a challenge.
Right.
So we have to see. We have to see the situation is in flux, it's evolving, and we have to be nimble-footed.
Right. A short statement from you, Ambassador Singh, and then I want to go to Fred and Siddhant also with us still. Ambassador Singh, as we are picking up, we don't want to obsess about the S-400, but sources within the Defense Ministry here in India and, of course, top sources in Russia had, indicated that the S-400 was done deal. But now we're picking up that it may be in the process of being done and not still there.
So I think, as you said, we should not obsess over whether the agreement is signed, not signed, moved a step ahead. The important thing is that India continues to move forward towards finalization of the S-400. So that's the important point, that India is taking its own decisions related to what kind of defense cooperation it wants with Russia, and it will not be impacted or influenced in that by the preference of any other country. So that's the important message. The details of timing of the agreement, etc., I think it's really a matter of speculation. It's better not to get too involved in that.
Okay. And these are, of course, visuals coming in of the Prime Minister and President Putin. Let me go across to Siddhant. Siddhant, now still a full day left for President Putin before he heads back. Among that, of course, a meeting with business leaders as well. That will be key. Take us through the rest of his day. Siddhant.
Well, of course, the meet with the business leaders and, of course, meet with the children are one of the key highlights left. But, of course, you never know if the Prime Minister of India goes to the airport to depart the President of Russia. Because remember, in Sochi, the Russian President had done so, and the Prime Minister of India might do the same. But other than that, if we look at the speech, the highlights were on economy, on trade, Iran and other related stuff, and focusing on a world which is multilateral. And remember, India-Russia ties have withstood a lot of things, including the collapse of the Soviet Union and, of course, the rise of a new world order. This world order is also currently churning. And it's interesting to note that Indian Prime Minister mentioned Indo-Pacific, a construct which have been adopted by a lot of countries in Asian region, specifically ASEAN and the Pacific countries, but not by China. And Russia also has been wary about this. Last month, External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj went to Russia as part of the annual meeting between of India, in which this was discussed, and India told the Russians that it's a construct which is an inclusive construct in which most of the world powers and, of course, various states should come and should take part. But Moscow will be wary to be adopting this concept because it's a Washington-led concept, and of course India is the other bookend of this concept. So Moscow will be wary of this entire new concept which is being put out by India and by Washington. But largely this is a relationship which has withstood the test of time, and will see more and more development, specifically on S-400. I just got a flash saying that the MEA will be shortly releasing the joint press statement. We do expect
Siddhant, I think it's you're right, Siddhant. I think that's already happened. They have sort of sent out transcripts of the joint statement. I think, Siddhant, if we give you a minute there, it's going to to be para 45, I guess, of the joint declaration there, which does make a clear mention of the S-400 Siddhant. So this is what we were talking about, the fact that there was no mention of that in the press statement, but the joint declaration has made a reference to the S-400, and critical final touches were to be given to this. That's what the national broadcaster was saying earlier, Siddhant. So it looks like a done deal there.
Innovative model.
Siddhant.
Yeah, it's a done deal, and we have got the release. The S-400 has been signed. It is confirmed by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. The two sides welcome the conclusion of the contract of S-400 deal. This is confirmed by India that the deal has been signed. Just in the release has the joint press statement has been released by the Ministry of External Affairs. It said that the two sides reaffirmed their commitment to enhance military technical cooperation between India and Russia, which has a long history of mutual trust and mutual benefit, and it's a pretty long joint statement. It's the para 45 of the joint statement mentioned that the deal has been done, and it's of course it's a done deal, it's a through deal, and of course that will bring smile on the faces of the journalists who are waiting here, because there was no mention by the leaders here, but now the joint statement has been released and it is confirmed that the deal has been done.
Right. And Siddhant, in fact, we are going through the para 45 right now, which says that sides welcome the conclusion of the contract of supply of S-400 long-range surface-to-air missile systems. And as you pointed out very clearly, as in the case of the French, the Russian joint declaration seems to be quite long as well, which in fact shows that this relationship has gone well beyond defense. We've seen 8 agreements being signed, on agriculture, on railways, on space cooperation, in nuclear field, in the field of small and medium enterprises, when it comes to energy needs. So this is a vast length of things we're looking at in terms of cooperation on both sides. And also, Siddhant, if I can give you a moment, there's a long list of things that they've mentioned when it comes to terrorism as well. Both sides are underlining, serious concerns when it comes to terrorism.
Yes, terrorism is something that, of course, was bound to be mentioned in the press statement, but Afghanistan is being mentioned in the press statement. We saw it being mentioned by the leaders, and both sides were saying that they welcome an Afghan-led resolution of the entire conflict. Other than that, there is, of course, mention of the nuclear and the cooperation between both the countries, and mention of universities cooperation between both the countries, focusing on people-to-people contact between both the countries. But the pillar of the entire press statement seems to be on the S-400 deal, something which we here at Wion broke first. We reported about 2 hours ago that the S-400 deal has been signed. We were the first electronic channel to report that, and now it has been confirmed that the deal is through. Indian side and the Russian side signed it today here in New Delhi, and of course there was no mention by both the leaders on the deal, but now it has been confirmed. The Russian media is also reporting that the deal was signed, but there was no official confirmation back then. Now the confirmation has been given both by the Kremlin and the Indian External Affairs Ministry that the deal has been signed by the Indian Prime Minister and the President of Russia. Interestingly, the Defense Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was present. She had to be present because the deal was very important, but she cut short her visit to Mongolia to come back to sign this deal. She was on a 2-country visit to Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and she cut short her Mongolia visit to come here so that this deal can happen.
Right. And in fact, Siddhant, stay with us. I'll just go back to Fred Weir, who is with us from Moscow. And Fred, I'm sorry to keep highlighting the S-400, how important that has been for us, how critical it has been for our security needs. We dumped the United States third, air-to-defense missile systems for this. And this is a very, very lengthy joint statement. As I was pointing out earlier, it highlights the importance of this relationship that we have with Russia. And it's so wide-ranging in the term, in the things that it covers, from space cooperation to small and medium enterprises to energy needs, to railways. It covers just about everything. Fred.
Well, yeah. Well, yes, it is, and it is in the nature of these kind of statements. I mean, when these summits take place, they do ring all the bells and whistles. But there are, I mean, obviously you're focusing on the defense component, and it usually is, when it's India and Russia, that the defense deals usually are the big meat. Let's hope that in future other things become also equally important. There are things like the railroads, and there's the north-south transport corridor, this idea it would have to pass through Iran, Azerbaijan, to Russia, and on to Europe. But there is a plan in place, and there are ideas. And in a better world than the one we're inhabiting, these kind of ideas would be taking front and center. You know, to really put some essence, some substance to the Indian-Russian relationship, you need reliable transport. And that would be that would really be a breakthrough if it comes to pass. But there are so many obstacles right now, but I'm sure they discussed it, and I'm sure there are people working on these ideas, and I think we need a different. We need the global political order to settle down and establish some new rules before some of these grander schemes start to take shape.
Yeah. And in fact, I do want to talk a little bit more about the railway cooperation. Now, that's something that seems to be an area of interest for many countries, and not just Russia. Fred, the fact that the Chinese are interested in investing in the Indian railways, as are the Japanese and the Russians as well. But I certainly agree with you when you say that we certainly need a new global order for some of these things to be put in place. The fact remains that Donald Trump, the U.S. president, is totally changing the world order, where he doesn't believe in multilateralism, and that seems to be the bigger challenge for both the developed world and the developing world when it comes to global cooperation.
Yeah, I think that countries like India and Russia need to put their views forward more forcefully on the world stage. The world order is changing. It's going to be a multipolar world. There are just many centers of civilization emerging, coming up. India is definitely one of them. And they need to find a place there has to be a concert of nations where we work out these things together. Brazil is another one. The countries of the BRICS in general. There need to be more forums, and these countries need to find their voice. I think India is moving toward that, where it will sort of kind of stand up and say what kind of world it wants to be part of. And this process is what's facing us in the next few years.
And I'm just going to go back to Siddhant in a bit. But Fred, also, of course, this is very key to our negotiations with other countries. And this is something that's been reiterated by both Russia and India today, the centrality of the United Nations, and the fact that both sides, believe that they adhere to sanctions by the United Nations, but not obviously by the United States. And that's critical, a critical message being sent to the Trump administration, possibly.
Against countries, they're slapping on sanctions. It's like almost, if this is Friday, there must be a new raft of sanctions coming out of the Congress in Washington. It is a little bit mad, and I don't know how this is going to end. But it has to. We have somehow the United States has to settle its own foreign policy, how it's going to relate to the world. And it's in a strange mode. I don't want to say really aggressive, but they are trying to assert a model of relations with the rest of the world that cannot work. And this is the stormy waters we're going to be passing through in the few years to come.
and as we keep, of course, going through the joint statement, many highlights about the fact that the Russian side continues to support India's need to be on the UN Security Council, and the reforms needed at the UN Security Council to better reflect the current world order and also to make it more effective in dealing with the emerging global challenges. And that Russia has, of course, reiterated its unwavering support to India for a permanent membership in the expanded UNSC as well. So that, of course, once again being highlighted in the joint statement. And also that the sides reaffirmed their commitment to fully implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as well. They talked about railway cooperation. The sides reiterated their commitment to further strengthen global non-proliferation, and also cited the necessity for early adoption of rules, norms, principles of responsible behavior of states, as well as acknowledged the necessity to establish a framework of cooperation among the BRICS nations. So wide-ranging discussions, and that's what's been highlighted in the joint statement as well, and that they will continue to interact and coordinate at regional multilateral forums like the BRICS, G20, ETSIO, and the East Asia Summit as well is also in the joint statement. And of course, lots on the military cooperation, the S-400 being the big headline-making story today, that deal has now been signed, despite India, of course, ignoring the United Nations sanctions under GATSA as well, and taking that plunge. Remember, 70% of our are also something that have been fulfilled mostly from the Russians and from the Iranian side as well. And both sides highlighted in their press statements, the Prime Minister Modi, of course, pointing out that Russia and President Putin were this was a privileged partnership between the two sides, that they had discussed at length the matters pertaining to Afghanistan, the Indo-Pacific, the G20 and other multilateral forums where they will be cooperating as well. The Russian president, of course, said that they would like trade relations to be increased and to be doubled in the next couple of years. The trade should increase to $30 billion by 2030 is something he pointed out, and that mutual trade has already grown by 21%. Energy sector we continue to cooperate in is what President Putin said, and that over the next few decades we believe that we will be cooperating and developing 12 other power units in India as well. And also, of course, the space mission and the space cooperation came up. The key highlights of President Putin's speech, of course, being that there is coherence in key international issues, and there will be heightened cooperation. Iran's nuclear deal was also something that came up, and all in all, it was a constructive dialogue between the two sides.